book of business is a book of business. It's an intangible concept, right? You're not selling a widget factory where someone could just come in and push the buttons and pull the levers behind the scenes and nothing changes for the end client experience. It's a new person who's going to be the face of their financial future.
Welcome to Advisor Talk with Frank LaRosa, brought to you by Elite Consulting Partners. It's the only podcast offering unfiltered guidance and the direct advice for all things concerning financial advisors, RIAs, and the practitioners in the wealth management business. And now, welcome to the show.
Hey everybody, welcome to Advisor Talk with Frank LaRosa. I'm Brian Lutz, Chief Marketing Officer of Elite Consulting Partners, and today I'm joined by Joseph Greco, Managing Director for Elite Advisor Successions, for a very special episode, a M&A episode, if you will, on Is the Robot Correct? Joe, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Brian. No, Frank's not here today, but I think hopefully me and you could tag team this pretty well. So.
Listen, first time you and I have been in the box together, I'm very much looking forward to it. This is going to be a really interesting episode because one of the things I sat down and I talked to Joe about was let's ask ChatGPT some questions about what an advisor needs to know in terms of positioning their practice for sale. And what I want to do is take the answers that came out and ask our expert, Joseph Greco, many years in the business, does this on the day-to-day, of whether or not the robot is correct. Can we trust the internet to give us the accurate information that we need to move forward?
Yeah, I think this is going to be a great episode. At the end of the day, right, ChatGPT and AI, great, right? I think great overall, but, I'm a big believer in that. Not quite there yet for financial services. I think there's still a big human component to this business.
Our Chief Information Officer would agree with you. We talk a lot about co-intelligence. They can get you maybe 60% of the way there, but you need that human element to take you the rest of the way.
Absolutely.
So I've got 4 segments here for you, Joe. Let's go through each of them. We'll take it kind of like an interview style, and then we'll go from there. Number 1, your business is more than a book, it's a brand. This one's kind of talking about how you brand and how you position your business in the marketplace. First question that they're going to ask is why brand perception impacts the value of your practice. Do you think that it does?
It definitely does. And I think the bigger business that you have, the more brand perception is going to be a key factor in how a buyer looks at your business. And I'll especially say if you're in a rural area, not a heavily populated metro area, you have a bigger opportunity for your brand to stretch a little bit further, right? Because you don't have necessarily as many people in a square, 100-mile radius as if you live in New York City, right, or Los Angeles. So that brand recognition tends to travel a little bit farther than, say, if you had a, practice in Midtown Manhattan, right, next to 100 other financial advisory practices around the corner. A little bit of a different, kind of a scenario there. But if you're in rural Missouri, right, and you're the only advisor within 20 miles, naturally your brand tends to resonate a little bit further.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. This kind of leads into the second question of how your story, maybe it's an origin story, the culture of your practice, and the positioning of the influence you have in the markets that you just described, how does that influence buyer interests?
Yeah, great question. So, I think it kind of works both ways, right? Just like we at Elite Advisor Successions almost can create marketing material for our buyers to pre-sell themselves to a seller, I think you can almost look at it the opposite lens, right? When we send, say, a lead to a buyer, naturally the first thing they're going to do is try to check out the advisor's website, right? Kind of see what digital marketing content they have created. Not because they're looking to essentially, necessarily write a check for that content as well to bring it into the business, but it is part of the business sale, right? So if an advisor has done a great job branding themselves and they have a unique origin story or kind of a unique niche or niche, however you say it, kind of related to their practice, I think that it's always a positive for a buyer to say, hey, I can kind of play on that when I buy the business, right? Maybe, hey, I'm doing tax planning already, or I'm doing, estate-focused kind of family office type planning, and I can leverage some of that to kind of enhance what I'm already doing. So it's definitely never a negative, right? I would say it's only a positive if a seller is kind of creating their own branding before they sell their business. I think if the buyer can figure out a creative way to use it moving forward with their practice, it's only going to be a net plus.
Shameless plug, Joe has a really great checklist on eliteadvisorsuccessions.com of the things you need to focus on when preparing to sell your practice. For those that are listening to the podcast, I advise you to check it out. We'll include that link in the show notes at the bottom of the YouTube episode and also on the podcast episode as well. But Joe, what top tier buyers are really looking for beyond what are top tier buyers looking for beyond just AUM revenue?
Yeah, so I would say that, you have to have some sort of a digital presence. It shocks me how many advisors I speak with, even larger advisors, especially solo advisors who, don't even have a website. You Google them or you Google their email and nothing really comes up outside of like their broker check or maybe some, canned website that their broker dealer created for them or their RIA. So I would say at the bare minimum, you got to have a website, right? You have to have some sort of a landing avenue where a client or a prospect can go to even just learn the bare minimum about you. I would say, listen, if you don't have a website and you're looking to sell your business over the next 5 years, it's not really that expensive or cost prohibitive to hire a web developer to build a website. You can even find someone who kind of has something templated that looks decent that you can at least get out there to the community. Again, only going to help the optics when you look to sell your business.
That's great. In terms of positioning that practice, we always say that you want to position it for the right buyer, not just any buyer. What is building a brand? So the robot will say, and when I mention the robot, I'm talking about ChatGPT. That's just our little nickname for the AI tool here. But ChatGPT will say, building a brand that attracts an ideal, values-aligned successors. That's great advice, but how would you suggest that people do that?
Yeah, so I guess I'll say, the price is the price, right? When you work with qualified buyers throughout this process, they're going to come to the table with the money, right? So the money doesn't actually become the holdup, which I think is surprising for a lot of people to hear. When you work with qualified buyers, the money is almost table stakes, right? But to your point, Brian, I think if you can tell the origin story or tell about your values with your marketing for the, in the terms of a seller perspective, it almost helps you attract the right buyer, because naturally the buyer is going to want to work with someone who they're also aligned with from a values standpoint. Again, the money is important and the clients are important, but I find that when you can really match two parties who are very similar together that have the similar values, they tend to mix together very well and it just moves a lot quicker and both parties feel like it's going to be a good fit from a value standpoint.
I love that. The next question that I have for you was one that I was really excited to ask you, and I hope that I haven't been kind of rushing through this interview to get to it. But one of the things that the robot is asking advisors is, how consistent is your marketing and messaging to support a smoother transition? Do you think that consistent messaging on social platforms, email, communication to clients, and do you think that consistent marketing efforts on social advertising, et cetera, is important for a buyer investigating a practice?
Yes and no. I think some of the marketing needs to be behind the scenes to clients to just educate them and have the communication at a high level for them to completely understand what's going on with the business throughout the transition process. And hey, some of that may be public, right? There may be an announcement on Facebook or Instagram, hey, we've merged, or, we're discussing an ownership change and we're walking our clients through this, right? Something that is public facing so that the universe knows. But I think, respectfully, most of the communications in terms of marketing, quote unquote, is actually not seen publicly. It's behind the scenes to say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, you've been a valued client of mine for a long time. I wanted to let you know, right, I'm in the process of discussing my succession plan. Typically what we see is that there's some level of obviously one-on-one contact with them. We're setting up joint meetings and phone calls, but then there's also emails, letters that go out via snail mail, as we call it, right? The old school letter that actually gets mailed to your house that you open. I think all those things working together in tandem just ensure that, hey, we're getting to every single client, right? Because the reality is financial advisors out there, you don't speak with all of your clients 4 or 5 times a year, right? There are some clients who are kind of on the wayside, maybe a client that has a small account that doesn't necessarily warrant 4 meetings a year. Those are the hardest clients to get through. So you need to make sure you're kind of leveraging all those marketing channels to be able to get to those clients and make sure that they're fully educated. The last thing that we want to have happen, is the buyer comes in, the practice changes hands, and the clients have no idea that it happened. That's when deals blow up and they go south.
Sure. Yeah. So if I'm hearing you right, hanging a banner outside of your office saying under new management is not the way to go.
Love it. No, that's definitely not the ideal marketing strategy.
Well, what are some of the other common mistakes that you see advisors pursue when they're trying to position their practice, or even once they've agreed with a buyer on a transition? What are some of those common mistakes that you see?
Yeah, so I would say at the end of the day, you really need to look at every single client. Remember that the buyer doesn't know all the personality and the quirks and the hot buttons right with your client. So, what I always recommend is, when you do a transaction like this, you really need to look at every single client. Hey, Jim Smith, Republican, don't talk about Democrats and vice versa, right? Politics, religion, all those things, right, get in the way of business. So you really need to educate the buyer on what to say and what not to say and the personality types of some of these clients. The reality is almost every client should have a custom tailored strategy, right? If you want to meet with me over a virtual meeting, Brian, and that's what you're comfortable with, I'm not banging down the door trying to get you into the office, as that's not going to make the most sense, right? So I think what I see is that the seller rushes it a little bit. You need to be just realistic about it and self-aware enough to understand that, the person you're selling your business to, while they're a good fit and they have the money and the transaction makes sense, they don't know your clients, right? You have 30 years sometimes of experience working with these clients. You need to figure out a good way to transfer all that trust and that data and that know and that wherewithal from those clients to the buyer. If you don't do that, trust me, there's going to be mistakes, right? You need to really go through each client one by one, especially the A and the B clients and the clients that really value most for the transaction.
That's really great advice. And, Joe, a lot of the transitions that you deal with and you help facilitate, do you find that a lot of those things that you just pointed out are identified or memorialized within a CRM solution, or they're just kind of kept in notes, or are they in an advisor's head?
All the above. Yeah, I would say, and again, back to our point about how to sell a practice properly, the better the data that you have in terms of not only the business data, but the client data, the more a buyer's going to look at it and say, wow, I have everything I need right now to be able to make this transaction a success. If you have paper files, something I've recommended and we've executed on before is actually helping the seller and the buyer hire someone to actually scan those files in to make them digital. The worst thing is that it's in the advisor's head, right? That's something that we need to brain dump out and really make sure that we can document everything. The reality of it is it's not documented. You can't assume the other person's going to know it, right? So we need to get all that knowledge out there and be transparent about it so that the buyer can really effectively take over that business as best as he can.
Yeah, I can't imagine taking over a decent sized book with an older advisor who wants to sit down with you for a couple of days and just do a knowledge transfer in his conference room.
Right.
That just
not going to make you feel confident, right?
No, not at all, right? All right, so let's talk about client retention through the transition. Brand continuity or brand positioning has always been a big thing in getting your practice out there and acquiring new clients. But in the transition, how important is brand continuity and the trust that you've built with those clients during an ownership exchange?
It's important, but I think the thing that ChatGPT completely misses here in that it's a collaborative decision, right? The reality is you have two companies. They both have two separate brandings, right? So not only is there a restriction sometimes on what you can and cannot do in the broker-dealer universe, right, that you need to be aware of, but obviously the company may not be one brand or the other, right? Sometimes I've seen situations where we keep the seller's DBA because, again, they've created a great branding and they're well known in their area. And it may make sense to just roll in that DBA under an ADV, right, on the RIA side, where it's just a separate company under the main company. Other times, what I see very common is that, for the most part, with these deals, the seller is usually about, or we'll say the buyer is usually 4 to 5 times as large as the seller, right? That's usually the transactions that we help broker. So for the most part, the buyer usually thinks that their brand is better, right? So it's a kind of a collaborative conversation to say, hey, while you built a great brand, there has to be some sort of a process where over the next 2, 3, 4 years, we slowly transfer the brand to me, right? To my brand, right? Because I feel as I'm the buyer, I want my brand to kind of be the victor in this because I'm the one buying your business, right? Sure. So it is a very tailored, bespoke conversation, I think, with all of these deals that we do. Again, I've seen deals where we keep both branding separate and they just kind of work behind the scenes to kind of do the transaction. But most common that I see is that the seller usually gives up the branding to the buyer at some point. It's usually not initially. It's over the course of usually a few years to be able to put a real table play on it.
Right. I got to imagine it's a slow burn because ultimately there's going to be efficiencies within the practice to market one brand versus two.
Exactly.
2 different types of letterhead, 2 different types of email signature, 2 different domains to manage. I mean, there's a lot going on. And yes, there's ways to automate all of those processes, but that's a great call out to identify what that timeline looks like to sunset one brand and roll it into the other.
Exactly.
So you mentioned this earlier in that there's a right way to do this and a wrong way to do this. And under new management, that banner that hangs outside of the office is the wrong way. But talk a little bit about the communication strategies that kind of ease client uncertainty in the time of a transition.
Yeah, great question. So I'm a big believer, and especially when I have these conversations with sellers, on painting the vision, right? I always want the seller to paint their vision, ideally to me, about how their succession looks, right? I want the buyer to paint the vision about how it's going to work with the seller, right? I think once you get all the vision out there, you can kind of work backwards on what the communication is going to look like. So I would say, for a rule of thumb, over communicating with clients is way better than under communicating with them, right? If you can paint the vision for them to say, hey, you've been a valued client for years, right? Over the next few months, you may see some branding changes. Keeping it a little out there, right? Not necessarily saying, hey, on August 1st, we're going to change the brand, but to say, hey, over the next 4 to 6 months, right, you may see some changes. And hey, if that timeline changes, there needs to be a follow-up communication that goes out to the clients to make sure that they completely understand what's going on. But, just keep it visionary. If you can kind of paint the vision for the client on how the next year is going to look, again, that makes them comfortable because they feel like they're heard. They feel like they can kind of understand what's going on. If you're under communicating with them and then you're making changes without their knowledge, that's when bad things happen. That's when client gets jumpy. They feel like, you're not thinking about them. You forgot to include them on an email. But meanwhile, you just really weren't self-aware enough to realize that, hey, you really have to coddle these relationships, right? At the end of the day, there's nothing holding a client to work with you or the buyer. They can go find another financial advisor, right? I mean, that's the reality of it. So I think if you kind of really internalize that and realize that, hey, all of these client relationships are gold, the more informed that you're going to be throughout the process, the more the client is going to want to stay with you.
Joe, what about timing of communication? Should an advisor let some of their top clients or all of their clients know that they're considering a succession plan? Or should that only come up once a deal is executed and they're far along enough down the path where they know that the transition is going to happen and the succession is in place?
Yeah, great question. I would say that we normally address that 95% of the time once, we are signed on the dotted line, right? The reality is no changes are immediate after that, right? We're still putting a plan together on how the actual process is going to work, regardless of if the seller's wired money at that point, right? It's a little bit of a different process on both sides of the coin between the transaction and actually the client communication. So, at the end of the day, we just want to be very upfront with the clients to really make sure that we can completely communicate what's going on. And again, the more that the buyer and the seller speak regarding that, the more we're going to have success.
And you talked about this earlier that, some people prefer one form of communication versus another and how it's important to memorialize all of that information so that you're not banging down someone's door to communicate that, there's a succession plan happening. But how many, maybe this is a curveball and maybe it's just going to be, case dependent, but how many times should you talk to your clients to, make sure that they feel comfortable in this transition so that the seller is receiving the value that they're expecting in the transition?
Yeah, so I would say that, outside of just meeting clients jointly with the buyer, which you will do with most of the clients, there needs to be updates on the seller, whether it comes from the seller or the buyer on kind of how the process is working. And a point I forgot to hit on the last question is that, trust me, your clients are already asking you about succession or they're thinking about it, right? Mm-hmm. If you're in your 60s or your 70s, trust me, subliminally, your clients are kind of questioning when you're going to retire.
Right.
So again, the more that you communicate with them, the better. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. And it actually made me spawn another question here. How much of the responsibility in the communication in the transition is the seller versus the buyer?
Yeah, so I would say at some point, once the buyer is kind of doing more than 50% of the actual client contact, it then becomes about the buyer in conjunction with the seller to communicate. But I've seen some extremely creative strategies. You definitely want to touch them at least a few times a year with an email. I've seen creative strategies where even a year after the seller retired, the buyer sent them an update on the seller. Like, hey, I know you've been wondering about Jim. He just bought a beach house in Florida, and here's a picture of him on his boat. Wow. Those feel-good moments kind of resonate with the clients to say that, hey, it just wasn't a business transaction. It was actually a true transfer of trust. And I'm glad that Jim retired. As such, I'm now with the buyer, and it's been a good experience. The more that you can kind of wrap in those warm and fuzzies behind the communications, the better. But yeah, to answer your question, once the buyer is really the face of the client communications moving forward, and the clients understand that, hey, the seller, for the most part, is out of the picture, they're around, but they're stepping back. I think at that point, it really is the responsibility of the buyer to really lead those communications.
That's great. Last topic here, preparing your brand, preparing your practice for succession before it's time to sell. And the robot's asking why succession planning and brand development should happen in parallel. So if you're thinking about succession, should you still be building new business?
I would say building new business, yes. I mean, at the end of the day, the bigger your practice is when you sell it, right, the more value it's going to be. So I'll never discourage advisors from prospecting as they're going through the succession process. Definitely not. But at the end of the day, I mean, listen, if you're on the fence about spending $100,000 to shoot a video series, before you sell your business, maybe that's kind of a discussion that you have with the buyer to understand if that's actually going to be worth your time and your money. Because again, remember, when you're selling your business, you're winding down. And I find that, if you're in your typical succession age, again, 60s or 70s, not to make it, ageism or anything like that, but that's just the reality of most of the conversations we have, you're probably not looking to spend more money on marketing at that point. You're thinking about more winding down and spending less time in the business. So yes, I think it does have a value, but I think if you're really far down the line with inking a deal with a buyer, it should be a collaborative conversation because the buyer may say, listen, I already have some of that created, or hey, I already have a relationship with a marketing company. I'll just do that for us. You don't need to spend this money. I'll kind of do this on behalf of the partnership. So I sort of agree with it, but a lot of me says, again, just being realistic about it, when you're winding down, your mind isn't growing. Your mind isn't thinking about growth-oriented opportunities. It's the opposite, right? So that makes sense.
Well, and that actually leads me into my next question is that how early should an advisor be planning to maximize valuation when thinking about a succession plan?
I would say at minimum 5 years before they're looking to sell.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And again, even up until the time they ink the deal. And again, there's creative things that we do with some of these agreements. Like we've done before, we give the seller an incentive to still convert some of the assets to fee-based over the time when they're still on board with the buyer because they're doing some of that work for the buyer. There may be an incentive to still go out and remake. Like I've advocated for sellers to put things in agreements like, hey, if you're bringing $1 million account over the course of the 2 years when you're still on, the expectation is you don't service them, but you get a one-time bonus, say 1% of assets under management, right? You bring in $1 million account, you get a $10,000 bonus for a one-time rainmaker type activity. So, I think there are ways that we can align the buyer and the seller that if the seller says, listen, I still got 2 strong years left in me while I sold my business, I still want to go out and kind of help you grow this. And if I could be compensated fairly to do that, I'd love to do it. I find that that's very common because at the end of the day, if they can still get a value for that business or, just rainmake a little bit before they actually exit the industry completely. I mean, again, we're talking about financial advisors here, right? Yep. They're going to want to do that, right? And both parties are aligned.
So let me throw a curveball at you. If I'm an RIA and I have, 5 or 6, smaller RIAs in my prospect pipeline from my own M&A activity, but I'm, potentially looking to sell mine, would I want to fast track my own deal to maximize my RIA to sell it for a greater value? Or should I not try to accelerate that close and just focus on what I have currently?
So to clarify the question, if you have your own deals kind of brewing in the pipeline?
Yes.
I mean, at the end of the day, I think it benefits you to do the deals first because, again, you then own the equity in those deals that you're then selling. Mm-hmm. That being said, I mean, being realistic about it, I think that it may be hard for you to become a good buyer in terms of optics if you're going to turn around and sell your business to somebody else, right? I think you need to really be able to communicate that openly with with the sellers that you're speaking with. But in terms of actually maximizing your own value, not to be selfish about it, but if that's kind of the thought process, yes. I mean, listen, if you have a 5-year timeline and you're looking to also do some M&A deals before you sell, it probably is in the best interest of you to do those deals first or have a very transparent conversation with the person who's going to buy your business to say, hey, I have some deals in my pipeline. If I bring these to the table, can we either partner on these from a capital standpoint? How would that look?
Oh, that's interesting.
We've done the most creative deals you can think of inside of Elite Advisor Successions regarding multiple entities. So you can look at it a bunch of different ways, but at the end of the day, I'll just bring it back to the clients. You don't want to give the clients a bad experience, right? Changing hands of advisors multiple times over the course of a 10-year period, again, doesn't really make you feel comfortable as a client. So you just have to keep that in mind with anything that you do.
So to be fair to the robot, that was to satisfy my own curiosity. That wasn't one of the things that ChatGPT wanted me to ask you. But one of the things when we were talking about maximizing value and how early you need to plan ahead, one of the other questions that they had too was how early do you need to start thinking about client retention as it relates to potentially selling your practice and putting plans in place to begin kind of maybe identifying how many clients will come with a transition versus how many are probably going to close up shop.
Yeah, I think that once you're in the mindset of, hey, I need to do something regarding my succession plan, you should already be thinking about that. I think client segmentation is something that I think gets lost in the mix with advisors, and I'm a big believer in that you should always be segmenting your clients to say, hey, as I'm growing, I don't need to necessarily be spending 4 hours a year with Mr. or Mrs. Smith, right? I have a junior advisor who should take over that relationship. But I think the reality is, as you go through this process, nobody knows your clients better than you, right? So, if you do know that there's some clients who you think are going to jump ship with a buyer, not only do you need to put more of a tailored, bespoke communication plan together with those clients to try to retain them, but you should be transparent with the buyer to say, hey, respectfully, I think Mr. and Mrs. Smith may leave if we do this deal, right? They kind of told me, if you retire, I'm going to find a new advisor. They've told me all the things that kind of allude that they may leave. So I need to leverage your knowledge, right, to be able to put a plan together for some of these clients. Again, you don't want to always paint the business as a complete rosy picture to a buyer, and it's not, right? That's when the business deals kind of go south. I'm a big believer that the more transparent you can be with the buyer when you come to the table with your clients, the better, because they're going to want to unturn every stone, right, when they do deals like this, right? So if you can be very forefront, very upcoming with everything that's going on in the business, the better. You want to get it all out there, right? The last thing you can do is have unfortunate surprises in deals. That's when you kind of build some bad blood between people.
So you hit on something that I took a note on, client segmentation. I think we're going to put a pin in that because I think that could be a whole other conversation that I'd love to dig into.
Sure.
But a lot of really good stuff here. I think that, ChatGPT had some pretty good ideas, but I've learned a lot from talking from you today. I think that you can find a lot on the internet, but I think this conversation, I hope, has just kind of raised or shown a light on the fact that there's only so much that you can get from the internet, and a conversation with someone like yourself would really kind of open their eyes to the things that you don't know.
Yeah, no, it's I'll just wrap it up with this. Remember, a book of business is a book of business. It's an intangible concept, right? You're not selling a widget factory where someone could just come in and push the buttons and pull the levers behind the scenes and nothing changes for the end client experience. It's a new person who's going to be the face of their financial future, right? You manage some of these people's life savings, right? They rely on you to make sure that they can retire and they can be successful in retirement. So, just remember that. It only takes the littlest quirk, right, for some clients to get the wrong idea. So you really need to put a real plan together with the buyer. And at the end of the day, it's still a very human business, right? AI has come into the business, and there's robo-advisors, and there's some things that, over the last 10 years or so, that's changed the wealth management industry. But the reality is, clients want to hear from a real person, right? They want to get to know a real person. They want to communicate with someone who understands their situation. And I think we're years upon years away from AI or robots ever taking control of that business or our business in wealth management. So for the foreseeable future, guys, you still need to focus on this stuff, and it's very important.
Well, and not for nothing, but to your point, you're not going to upload your CRM to ChatGPT and say, how much do I get for my business?
Exactly.
So, Joe, how do they find you to ask you more questions?
Absolutely. So you're welcome to email me, Joseph, Joseph, at eliteconsultingpartners.com, or you can give me a call at the office, area code 516-265-1410.
Awesome. Guys, as always, thanks for listening. Hope you've enjoyed this podcast. ChatGPT is okay, but Joe's better.
Love it.
Thanks, guys. Have a great week.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to Advisor Talk with Frank LaRosa. If you're looking for more advice or solutions on any topics relating to the financial services industry, or just want to subscribe to our podcast, head on over to eliteconsultingpartners.com/podcast.